Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
This happened almost 10 years ago when I was working for the campus catering company. I was fresh out of college, desperate for any job that would pay my bills, while I figured out what to do with my life. The company mostly did small campus events, faculty meetings, student organization gatherings, that sort of thing. The food was consistently awful. I'm talking about chicken that sat under heat lamps for hours until it looked like rubber, and pasta that was so overcooked it practically dissolved when you looked at it. But somehow we stayed in business, probably because we were cheap and convenient. When my boss told me we were catering a wedding, I was shocked. Who in their right mind would want our terrible food at their wedding? But apparently the father of the groom was some big shot professor or administrator on campus, and he pulled some strings to have the wedding held in the campus chapel with us doing the catering. I felt sorry for whoever was getting married. The day of the wedding, I was assigned to manage the main course station. I stood behind this long table covered with our usual disasters, chicken drowning in some thick, congealed sauce that looked like it had been sitting out for days, and what was supposed to be vegetarian pasta primavera, but was really just overcooked noodles swimming in cheap, nasty oil with a few sad vegetables thrown in. I love pasta primavera when it's done right, but this stuff was absolutely disgusting. I wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. The wedding reception was winding down and I was getting ready to pack up the main course and bring out the dessert when I noticed this kid hanging around my station. He was maybe 10 years old, definitely old enough to know better, and he kept giggling and looking at the tablecloth like he was planning something. I could tell by the way he was acting that he was up to no good. Then I saw him grab the edge of the tablecloth, still giggling like a maniac. I knew exactly what he was planning. I told the kid not to even think about it, and warned him that it was going to end very badly. But he just giggled more and started pulling on the cloth. I could see all the hot food about to go flying. The Sterno cans that were keeping everything warm, the whole disaster that was about to unfold. So I walked over quickly, took the tablecloth out of his hands, and told him to scram. Then I went back behind the table, smoothed my apron, and tried to get back to my awful job. That's when this woman came storming over. She demanded to know why I had chased her baby and insisted that he wasn't doing anything wrong. I explained that her child was about to pull the tablecloth down and it was my job to stop him. I told her that if I didn't, I could be fired. And that was true. Just a few months earlier, one of my co-workers had been fired when some kid knocked over a whole table at a faculty dinner. My boss didn't care that it wasn't her fault. The woman got even angrier and shouted that they were paying for this wedding. She demanded to know if I knew who she was. That's when it clicked. This was the mother of the bride. Great. I tried to tell her that I understood, but before I could finish explaining about the safety issues, she completely lost it. She actually jumped across the table and grabbed my head, trying to shove my face down into the tray of chicken sauce. This wasn't just any tray, it was sitting over a lit Sterno can, so the metal was burning hot and the sauce was practically boiling. I started hitting her and screaming because she was literally trying to give me third-degree burns. Then her husband, the father of the bride, came running over, and instead of stopping his wife, he decided to help her try to push my face into the sauce. I was clawing at both of them, trying to get away, when the groom and his father finally showed up and started trying to pull these psychos off me. The bride was screaming something about promising, though I couldn't really tell what she was saying because everything was chaos. And where was my boss during all this? Standing off to the side like a useless potato, not lifting a finger to help me. The worst part was the kid, the little brat who started this whole thing, just sitting there laughing like this was the funniest thing he'd ever seen in his life. In all the struggle, the table got knocked over and caught fire from the Sterno cans. Someone had to run and get a fire extinguisher, which made a huge mess and basically ruined what was left of the wedding reception. The bride was crying, half the guests were covered in our terrible food, and there was foam from the fire extinguisher all over everything. While the chaos was dying down, my boss pulled me aside. I was already planning to call the police and press charges. These people had literally assaulted me and tried to burn my face. My boss told me I couldn't talk to the police. I said that actually I could. Then he threatened to fire me if I talked to the police. I told him that was illegal and he couldn't do that. He just said it was my choice. Here I was, the victim of an assault, and my boss was threatening to fire me if I reported it. But I wasn't going to let these entitled jerks get away with what they did to me. So I called the police right there and pressed charges against both the mother and father of the bride. I also made sure to tell the officers exactly what my boss had said about firing me if I reported the assault. Turns out that's called retaliation, and it's very illegal. The police took statements from everyone, including several guests who saw the whole thing. Karen and her husband were arrested right there at their daughter's ruined wedding reception. The bride was mortified. Apparently, she had made her parents promise to behave themselves, which explained her screaming about promises when everything went crazy. After the police finished taking my statement, the bride came over to me with this huge slice of wedding cake. She apologized for her parents and told me to take the cake because she knew my boss was probably going to steal my tips anyway. She was right about that. My boss had a habit of pocketing the tip money that was supposed to go to the staff. But this time, with the police report and witnesses, he couldn't touch me. He couldn't fire me for pressing charges, and he couldn't retaliate against me without risking his own legal troubles. Karen and her husband ended up pleading guilty to assault charges and had to pay my medical bills and a fine. The kid never got in trouble, of course, but I heard that the bride went no contact with her parents after the wedding. I quit the catering job a few months later and found something better. But I'll never forget the day a 10-year-old's prank turned into a full-scale assault at a wedding reception, all because some entitled parents thought they could do whatever they wanted just because they were paying for the event. I work as an animal control officer for about 5 years now, and the job is never boring. My days are split between catching stray dogs that have wandered off, investigating reports of animal cruelty, and dealing with people who seem to think the laws don't apply to them. I got into this line of work because I care about animals and their welfare, though some days I wonder if I care more about the animals than their actual owners do. The county assigned me this position after I completed my training in animal handling and law enforcement procedures. Most of my calls are pretty routine: lost pets, animals that don't understand property boundaries, or the occasional rabies investigation. But every now and then I get a case that reminds me why this job can be so frustrating. When we receive reports of alleged animal cruelty, we have a specific protocol. First, I collect all the information I can from the caller. Then I look up the property owner to see if there's any history with our department. Finally, I head out to physically inspect the property as a high priority call. During regular business hours, I work 8 to 5, but I'm also on call for emergencies. The sheriff's office can contact me anytime they need assistance with an injured animal, an aggressive animal, or situations where the owner can't maintain custody of their pets. This case started on a Tuesday morning when I received a call about a property we'd visited before. Previously, we'd been there for animals running loose, but this time the caller reported that the animals were chained up without access to water or shelter. I gathered what details I could and made plans to head out first thing in the morning. When I arrived at the property, I could see that the owner had made some effort to restrain their animals using chains. When done properly, this isn't cruel. It actually helps prevent dogs from wandering off the property. However, when I walked around the accessible areas, I noticed that several animals didn't have water bowls within reach, and some had no shelter from the sun. I knocked on the front door several times, but nobody answered. Since the animals weren't in immediate danger and removing them would require a seizure warrant, I decided to provide water to the animals I could reach safely. Then I left a notice on their door asking them to contact our office. This is standard procedure for cases like this. The rest of my day was unusually quiet. I didn't have to bring any animals back to the shelter, which was actually kinda nice for a change. Later that evening, while I was at home, my phone started ringing. I could see it wasn't the sheriff's office calling, so I didn't answer. This is pretty normal. If there's a real emergency, people call the sheriff's office, not me directly. The phone rang a few more times with calls from numbers I didn't recognize, so I just let them go to voicemail. Then my phone rang again, and this time the caller ID showed it was the sheriff's office. I already had a feeling this wasn't going to be a pleasant conversation. I answered and introduced myself as the animal control officer. The deputy on the other end sounded confused when he explained that there was a guy on the line claiming his dog had been kidnapped. When I asked if the caller knew who had supposedly taken the dog, the deputy told me the man was blaming animal control. The deputy asked if it was okay to patch the caller through to me, and I agreed. Once the call was transferred, I asked the man how I could help him. He was clearly upset, and I could hear a woman shouting angrily in the background. The man accused one of our officers of kidnapping his dog for no reason, claiming we had said there wasn't adequate water and shelter when his dog was on his own property. He insisted the dog was a service animal that needed to be returned immediately. I confirmed he was calling from the Pine Creek area and acknowledged that he had tried calling earlier but couldn't reach anyone. I explained that I had been the officer who visited his property that day, but I assured him we hadn't taken any animals from his house. I asked him to describe what the dog looked like. After talking to someone in the background, the man became more agitated. He demanded to know where his dog was and complained about the notice I had left. He insisted all his animals were well cared for and described his missing dog as white and tan. He was convinced someone must have stolen the dog because it wasn't there anymore. When he gave me that description, I realized I had seen that exact dog on the property earlier. It had been running around without any restraints, which was actually better than being improperly chained up. I told him I had indeed seen his dog earlier, but I emphasized that I knew I hadn't taken it because I didn't impound any animals that entire day. I explained that I was the only officer on duty and apologized that I didn't know where his dog had gone. I promised to return the next morning to discuss the notice I had left. After more background conversation with someone at his house, the man grudgingly agreed but insisted he better get his dog back because it was a service animal. I was finally able to hang up, feeling completely confused about the whole situation. Then I noticed I had a voicemail from about 10 minutes earlier, which would have been just before the sheriff's office called me. When I played it back, I was shocked by what I was hearing. The voicemail was from the same man, and he was furious. He demanded that I call him back immediately and argued that his dog didn't need shelter because it was an inside dog that didn't spend nights outside. He claimed they had watered the dog that morning. Then he threatened to call the sheriff's office if I didn't return his call and warned that he would have me arrested for trespassing if I came on his property again. He actually demanded that I call the sheriff's office myself and insisted he wanted a deputy at his house within 15 minutes. I sat there staring at my phone. This guy had just called the sheriff's office to report that I had kidnapped his dog while simultaneously leaving me a voicemail that basically admitted his dog runs loose and threatened to have me arrested for doing my job. The next morning I went through my usual routine of paperwork, checking voicemails, and preparing myself with plenty of coffee. Before heading out to the property, I called the sheriff's office and requested that a deputy meet me there, given the man's threat to arrest me for trespassing while performing my official duties. When I arrived, I saw the deputy was already there waiting for me. I explained the entire situation to him and played the threatening voicemail I had received the night before. After listening to it, the deputy just shook his head and said the caller sounded like a real piece of work. We approached the house together, and this time when I knocked, a woman answered the door. A young man, presumably their son, also came out to talk with us. Their attitude was completely different from the hostile voicemail and phone call from the night before. The wife sheepishly admitted that they had found the dog and explained that it had been hiding under the porch the entire time. The son added that they had searched everywhere the day before, but hadn't thought to check underneath the porch. I went through the necessary changes that needed to be made for the dogs in their care, referring to the notice I had left the previous day. Throughout the entire conversation, both the wife and son were polite and cooperative. Interestingly, the man who had made all the threats and accusations was nowhere to be seen. Having the deputy there definitely kept things civil. After we finished discussing the required improvements to their animal care setup, I thanked the deputy for his assistance. His presence had clearly made the difference between a potentially confrontational situation and a productive conversation about animal welfare. Over the following months, I returned to that property several times to follow up on the changes they were making. To their credit, they did make improvements and ended up rehoming most of their dogs to families who could better care for them. I never once saw that so-called service dog wearing any kind of service vest, and frankly, I wasn't expecting to. I'm still waiting to be arrested for trespassing while doing my job. Somehow, I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. I'm a 34-year-old teacher who lives in a quiet neighborhood. I've been in my house for about 3 years now, and generally, the neighbors are decent people. There's the sweet elderly couple across the street who always wave when they see me, and the young family next door on the left who keep to themselves but are always polite. Then there's Karen on my right side. Karen moved in about a year ago, and from day one she's been the type of person who thinks everyone's business is her business. She's constantly peeking through her blinds, asking invasive questions, and acting like she's the unofficial neighborhood watch captain. I've tried to be polite, but she makes it really hard sometimes. Anyway, back in June, I had what was supposed to be a routine gallbladder removal surgery. Simple procedure, in and out the same day, back to normal life within a week. That's what my doctor told me, at least, but sometimes life has other plans. The surgery went wrong. Really wrong. What should have been a quick laparoscopic procedure turned into an emergency situation when they accidentally nicked something they shouldn't have. I woke up 3 days later in the intensive care unit with tubes coming out of everywhere and no memory of what happened. The next few weeks were a blur of pain, infections, and complications. I spent 25 days total in the hospital over the course of 2 months. Just when I thought I was getting better, something else would go wrong and I'd end up back there via ambulance. It was honestly the scariest time of my life. When I finally got stable enough to recover at home, my doctor arranged for home health nurses to come check on me daily. These nurses were absolute angels, helping me with wound care, monitoring my vitals, and making sure I was healing properly. Without them, I probably would have ended up back in the hospital again. The nurses usually came at different times depending on their schedules, and they were always professional and discreet. They'd park on the street, come to my door, do their work, and leave without bothering anyone. At least that's how it worked until Karen decided to make it her problem. I first noticed her lurking around when the nurses started coming. She'd find excuses to be outside whenever they arrived, checking her mailbox, watering plants, walking to her car. At first I thought it was just coincidence, but then I realized she was timing it on purpose. The confrontation happened on a Tuesday afternoon. I was resting in my living room when I heard voices outside. Through my window, I could see one of my regular nurses, a middle-aged woman who'd been nothing but kind to me, standing by her car looking uncomfortable. Karen was planted right in front of her, arms crossed like she owned the street. I cracked my window to listen because something felt off about the whole situation. Karen started by asking if the woman was a nurse. When the nurse confirmed she was, Karen immediately demanded to know why she was there. The nurse politely explained that she was providing care but couldn't share more information without permission from her patient. That wasn't good enough for Karen. She pressed further, asking if it was the man or woman in the house who was getting care. The nurse told her she couldn't reveal that information either. Karen insisted that she needed to know, as if her curiosity somehow gave her special rights. The nurse asked if Karen was family, and when Karen admitted she just lived next door, the nurse again refused to share any details. But Karen wasn't giving up. She argued that the nurse should tell her because if I had something contagious, she claimed the nurse was legally required to tell her. The nurse shut that down immediately, explaining that medical records are private and suggesting that Karen ask me directly if she wanted to know something. Karen then tried a different approach, claiming that one of the other nurses had promised to tell her but ran out of time. The nurse clearly didn't buy this story, pointing out that if that were true, Karen would already know what she wanted to know. Karen kept pushing, insisting that the previous nurse just hadn't had time and that this nurse should fill her in instead. When the nurse refused again, Karen tried yet another angle. She claimed that the neighbor across the street knew what was going on, so one of the nurses must have told him, but he wouldn't share the information with her. This was a complete lie. The neighbor across the street knew what was happening because I had told him myself. He's a retired paramedic who offered to help if I needed anything, and we become friends over the past few years. He earned the right to know by being a decent human being, unlike Karen. The nurse apologized but remained firm that she couldn't and wouldn't tell Karen anything. She said she needed to go inside to do her job. Karen wasn't done though. She suddenly demanded that the nurse move her car, claiming she couldn't park where she was. The nurse was confused, pointing out that she was parked on the street where other cars normally parked. Karen made up some nonsense about how someone else in the neighborhood might need that spot. This was ridiculous since that spot had been empty for months, and the only people who ever parked there were my visitors. The nurse said she wasn't moving her car and that she really needed to go inside now. Just when she started walking toward my door, Karen called out one final desperate question, asking if I had something contagious because she didn't want to get sick. The nurse refused to answer that too and said goodbye, practically running to my door. I let her in and apologized profusely for Karen's behavior. She just shook her head and said she'd dealt with worse, but I could tell she was rattled. After the nurse left, I watched Karen through my window. She stood on the sidewalk for a full 10 minutes, staring at my house and huffing like an angry bull. She kept checking her phone and looking around like she was waiting for someone to come validate her crazy behavior. That's when I decided I'd had enough. I called the police non-emergency line and explained the situation. The officer who came out was incredibly understanding. He went over and had a chat with Karen about harassment and respecting medical privacy. I don't know exactly what he said, but she went inside real quick after that. 2 weeks later, I was finally feeling well enough to do some yard work when I saw Karen rush outside. She exclaimed that she thought I had died because I looked so sick, and all those nurses kept coming. She insisted she had a right to know if there was something dangerous in the neighborhood. I told her that she actually didn't have any right to my medical information, and that harassing healthcare workers was illegal. She got defensive, claiming she wasn't harassing anyone and was just asking questions. I explained that interrogating my nurse for 10 minutes and then trying to make her move her legally parked car definitely counted as harassment. Karen shot back that if I had just told her what was wrong from the beginning, none of this would have happened. And there it was, the classic entitled person logic. Everything was somehow my fault for not catering to her demands. I told Karen straight out that I didn't owe her any explanations about my health. I pointed out that we were neighbors, not friends, and that she'd never shown me any kindness that would make me want to share personal information with her. She protested that she was always nice to me, which made me laugh. I reminded her about when she complained about my grass being too long while I was in the hospital, when she called the city on me for leaving my trash can out an extra day, and when she told the mailman I was probably dead because she hadn't seen me in a while. She hadn't realized I knew about all of that. I explained the difference between her behavior and that of my neighbor across the street. I told her how he actually knew everything because he'd been helpful and kind, offering to collect my mail, check on my house, and even giving me his phone number for emergencies. Meanwhile, she had done nothing but cause problems and stick her nose where it didn't belong. Karen sputtered that she'd never been treated this way, which gave me the perfect opening. I agreed with her. She'd never minded her own business, never treated people with basic human decency, and never respected boundaries. She walked back into her house and slammed the door. I haven't had any problems with her since then, and my nurses can now do their job in peace. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.